The Nanjing Massacre. In December 1937, Japanese Imperial Army forces entered the Chinese city of Nanjing and carried out 6 weeks of systematic violence that remains one of the most documented atrocities of the 20th century. The city had already surrendered. There was no military justification for what followed. Japanese soldiers moved through the streets and surrounding areas, killing civilians and prisoners of war in mass executions, some by bayonet, some by burning, some by drowning in the Yangtze River. Estimates of the death toll range from 100,000 to over 300,000, with historians still debating the precise figure. What is not debated is the scale. International observers, including diplomats and journalists stationed in the city, documented what they witnessed in real time, creating a record the Japanese government spent decades attempting to minimize. Women and children were specifically targeted in organized campaigns of violence. Men of military age were rounded up on suspicion alone and executed in groups. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East later convicted several Japanese commanders for their role in ordering or failing to prevent the massacre. General Iwane Matsui, who commanded the forces that entered Nanjing, was hanged in 1948. The city is never forgotten. The Holodomor. Between 1932 and 1933, the Soviet Union engineered a famine in Ukraine that killed between 3.5 and 7 million people, and the word engineered is used deliberately. The famine was not a natural disaster. Soviet authorities under Stalin's direction set impossibly high grain quotas for Ukrainian farms, confiscated food stores, sealed village borders to prevent starving peasants from leaving in search of food, and blacklisted communities that failed to meet targets, cutting them off from any outside supplies entirely. Ukraine's agricultural output had always made it one of the most productive regions in the Soviet Union, and that productivity made it a target. Stalin needed grain exports to fund industrialization, and he needed to break Ukrainian national identity and resistance to collectivization simultaneously. The result was mass starvation carried out through administrative policy. Bodies piled up in village streets, families ate grass, bark, and leather before dying. Soviet officials continued exporting grain to foreign markets throughout the famine. The USSR denied its existence for decades. Ukraine formally recognized the Holodomor as genocide in 2006, and more than 30 countries have followed. Russia has never acknowledged it. The bombing of Dresden. By February 1945, Germany's defeat was already a matter of when, not if. The war in Europe had perhaps 3 months left. Against that backdrop, British and American air forces carried out 4 raids on the German city of Dresden between February 13th and 15th, dropping thousands of tons of high explosives and incendiary bombs on a city packed with refugees fleeing the Soviet advance from the east. Dresden had minimal strategic military value at that point in the war. What it had was a dense civilian population and centuries of cultural architecture. The firestorm created by the incendiary bombs reached temperatures hot enough to melt glass and pull people off their feet through the suction of superheated air. Death toll estimates have ranged enormously, from 22,000 to over 100,000, with more recent historical analysis settling closer to 25,000. The raids were never formally classified as war crimes, partly because the Allies controlled the post-war tribunals. Winston Churchill himself later distanced himself from the decision, describing the bombing in a private memo as a serious query against the conduct of Allied bombing. That memo was suppressed for years. The My Lai Massacre. On the morning of March 16, 1968, a company of American soldiers entered the South Vietnamese village of My Lai and killed between 347 and 504 unarmed civilians over the course of several hours. There were no enemy combatants in the village. The soldiers encountered women, children, and elderly men preparing their morning meals. What followed was not a firefight. It was a systematic killing that included shootings and the burning of homes while people were still inside. A helicopter pilot named Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson, Jr. witnessed the massacre from the air, landed his aircraft between soldiers and fleeing civilians, and threatened to open fire on his own men if they continued. He's one of the few figures from that morning remembered with any honor. The Army initially covered the incident up. It only became public knowledge over a year later when investigative journalist Seymour Hersh broke the story. Lieutenant William Calley was the only soldier convicted, sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of 22 civilians. He served 3.5 years under house arrest before being pardoned. No senior officer was ever held accountable. The Armenian Genocide. Beginning in 1915, the Ottoman Empire, under the Committee of Union and Progress, the Young Turks, carried out a systematic campaign to eliminate the Armenian population within its borders. The trigger was World War I, which provided both the conditions and the cover. Armenian men were disarmed and conscripted into labor battalions, where they were worked to death or executed. Women, children, and the elderly were marched into the Syrian desert in death convoys with no food or water. Entire villages were burned. Mass executions were carried out along the deportation routes. Estimates of the death toll range from 600,000 to 1.5 million. The Ottoman government had telegraphed orders to provincial governors authorizing the deportations and killings, documentation that survived and has been studied by historians for over a century. Turkey has maintained for over 100 years that what occurred was wartime displacement rather than genocide, a position that has created one of the most sustained diplomatic disputes in modern history. As of 2021, the United States formally recognized the Armenian Genocide, joining over 30 other countries. Turkey recalled its ambassador in response. The Rwandan Genocide. In 100 days between April and July 1994, an estimated 800,000 people, primarily ethnic Tutsi, were killed in Rwanda. The mathematics of that figure require a moment to process. That is roughly 8,000 people every single day, 333 every hour, for 100 consecutive days. The genocide had been planned in advance. Extremist Hutu leaders had spent months stockpiling weapons, organizing civilian militias called the Interahamwe, and using radio broadcasts to identify Tutsi neighbors to their killers. When the plane-carrying Rwandan President Juvenal Habyarimana was shot down on April 6th, the killing began within hours, too organized and too immediate to have been spontaneous. The United Nations had peacekeeping forces in the country. They were ordered not to intervene. The United States, still processing the fallout from Somalia, avoided using the word genocide internally to sidestep the legal obligation to act. France, which had long supported the Hutu government, has faced decades of questions about its role. In 2021, a French commission concluded that France bore significant responsibility for enabling the conditions that made the genocide possible. Unit 731. Between 1937 and 1945, the Imperial Japanese Army operated a covert biological and chemical warfare research unit in occupied Manchuria known as Unit 731. What took place inside its facilities was among the most methodical human experimentation ever documented. Prisoners, predominantly Chinese civilians and prisoners of war, along with some Soviet, Korean, and Allied captives, were subjected to live surgical procedures without anesthesia, extreme cold exposure experiments, pressure chamber testing, and deliberate disease exposure. Researchers studied how long humans could survive contact with plague, cholera, and typhoid. They tested weapons on living subjects to assess the resulting injuries. An estimated 3,000 to 12,000 people died inside the facility. When the Soviet Union declared war on Japan in August 1945, Unit 731's commander Shiro Ishii ordered the facility destroyed and the remaining prisoners killed to eliminate evidence. What makes this case historically distinct is what happened afterward. The United States granted Ishii and his researchers immunity from war crimes prosecution in exchange for their experimental data. Not a single member of Unit 731 was tried at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. The Siege of Sarajevo. From April 1992 to February 1996, the city of Sarajevo endured the longest siege of a capital city in the history of modern warfare, 1,425 days. Bosnian Serb forces under the command of General Ratko Mladic surrounded the city, positioned snipers on surrounding hillsides, and subjected the civilian population to nearly 4 years of continuous shelling and targeted fire. Snipers were deployed specifically to kill civilians going about daily life, collecting water, crossing streets, attending funerals. Children were shot in playgrounds. An estimated 13,952 people were killed during the siege, of whom over 5,000 were civilians. The city's residents developed underground tunnels, improvised water systems, and entire parallel economies just to survive. The international community watched, debated, imposed arms embargoes that disadvantaged the besieged population more than the aggressors, and largely failed to intervene meaningfully until NATO airstrikes in 1995 finally forced a negotiated end. Mladic was arrested in 2011, tried before the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and convicted of genocide and war crimes in 2017. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. The conviction came 22 years after the siege ended. If you made it this far, drop a comment below and let us know which event you want us to cover next. Subscribe so you never miss an upload. There's a lot more where this came from.